Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to challenge a very specific image that I think most people have just burned into their brains.
Oh, yeah.
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 I want to play a quick word association game with you. If I say Colombian drug trade, what is the absolute first thing that pops into your head?
Oh, that's easy. I can almost guarantee it's the 1980s. It's, the Netflix series Narcos. It's Pablo Escobar,
Pablo Escobar.
white powder, and these incredibly violent cartels fighting in the streets of Medellin.
Exactly. It's the hippos, the mansions, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
We have this very cinematic, very violent view of how that industry worked.
We do.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Before Escobar, before the huge cocaine empires, and before the violence really spiraled up to that industrial scale, there was a completely different era. An era that historians and locals call the Bonanza Marimberos.
Right. And this isn't just like a prequel. It's the foundation. If you really look at the history, without this specific era, the cartels we all know today, they might never have existed.
What?
This was the training ground. It was the era that built the roads, sometimes literally, for everything that came later.
So today we're diving into a stack of insights from nuggnotes, covering a document called the Marimbero Era. And our mission is really to unpack how this all started.
Yeah.
And I have to drop the initial surprise right now, because this just blew my mind when I was reading the source material. The roots of the Colombian drug trade, they weren't in hard drugs.
Not at all.
And honestly, they weren't even really about drugs in the beginning.
No, it wasn't about cocaine, and initially it wasn't even about marijuana.
It started with coffee.
It did. And to understand that, you have to kind of zoom out and look at the global economy in the 1960s.
Okay.
We usually think of drug smuggling as this, isolated underworld thing that exists in a vacuum. But the sources make it so clear it is always tied to legitimate trade.
It's about market forces.
Exactly. Not just criminal intent.
But let's unpack this, because I'm looking at these notes and trying to connect the dots.
Yeah.
How does a morning cup of coffee lead to a global marijuana boom?
It's a classic case of unintended consequences. So in the late 1960s, there was this massive shift in how coffee was traded. You had a trade agreement between the United States and Colombia.
And other nations, right?
And other nations, yeah, that really tightened the control on coffee exports. The goal was, bureaucratic. They were trying to regulate prices, set strict quotas to stabilize the market.
Right. Standard economic policy.
Yeah.
Keep the prices from crashing for farmers. Keep the global market happy. In theory.
In theory. But in practice, what that did was create a massive bottleneck for producers and traders, especially in the greater Magdalena-region of Colombia.
So suddenly you have all this high-quality coffee and people who know how to move goods, but the front door is locked.
The front door is locked. The quotas said, you can't sell this legally right now, so naturally they used the back door.
Of course.
The smugglers in that region who were already, accustomed to moving things around the margins, they just shifted to illicit coffee exports to bypass those controls.
So they were already building the routes.
They were building routes, figuring out logistics, and learning how to move things without the government seeing. This created a whole class of specialized smugglers who knew the terrain better than anyone.
And the notes say that by the late 60s, these coffee smugglers started layering.
Layering. It sounds like a fashion term, but in smuggling, it's just efficiency.
Right.
They basically realized, hey, while we're moving this illicit coffee through these hidden routes we've built, we might as well toss in some cannabis.
This is a side hustle.
Completely. It was an add-on item at the checkout. I mean, the profit margins on coffee were tight. It's a bulk commodity. But the cannabis, that sweetened the deal considerably.
That is just wild to think about.
Yeah.
But where was the cannabis even coming from? Was this a new thing in Colombia?
Not at all. And the sources point this out. Farmers in Colombia had been growing cannabis since, the early 1900s.
Wow.
But for a long, long time, it was just a survival crop. It was grown for local use, maybe a little bit of regional trade. It definitely wasn't a global commodity yet.
So what changed? How do we go from survival crop tossed in with coffee beans to the main event? The notes mention a huge pivot in 1974.
1974 is the critical turning point. If you want to understand the modern drug trade, you have to understand this year. It's a perfect storm of supply and demand.
Okay.
On one side, you had the U.S. government putting massive, massive pressure on Mexico.
Right, because before this, most of the marijuana in the U.S. was coming from Mexico. That was the main supplier for the hippie generation.
Correct. But the U.S. pushed Mexico into these really aggressive eradication programs. This is where you might have heard about paraquat.
Paraquat. What's that?
It's a herbicide. The Mexican government, with U.S. backing, started spraying paraquat on marijuana fields to kill the crops. But it didn't just kill the crops, it created a panic in the U.S. market.
A panic. Why?
Rumors started spreading that Mexican weed was poisoned, that it was toxic.
Oh, wow. So the supply from Mexico dries up almost overnight because people are terrified of smoking poison.
Exactly. You squeezed the balloon in Mexico, but, and this is the key part, the demand in the U.S. wasn't going down. The counterculture was in full swing. Demand was actually spiking.
So the demand is high, the Mexican supply is gone.
And the balloon inflates in Colombia. The trade naturally shifted south, specifically to La Guajira and the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta.
And this brings us to the geography. I was looking at the descriptions in the notes, and it sounds like this place was literally designed by nature for smuggling.
Oh, absolutely. The notes call the corridor unbeatable, and they're not wrong.
Break that down for us. What made it so perfect?
Well, think about the topography. You have the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. It's the highest coastal mountain range in the world. I mean, you're talking about peaks that have glaciers on them, but they are right next to the Caribbean Sea.
So you've got these high mountain basins.
Exactly. Basins that are isolated, incredibly hard for authorities to reach, and they have these perfect microclimates for growing different strains. You're hidden in the clouds, essentially.
Plus the forest cover for concealment.
Right, but the real magic is what's at the bottom of the mountain.
The coast.
The coast. Usually, if you grow something way up in the mountains, getting it to a port is a logistical nightmare. But here, right at the foot of these mountains, you have the Caribbean. And not just open beaches, but coves, river mouths, hidden inlets.
So you grow it up high, bring it down low, and it's straight onto a boat. The commute is basically non-existent.
Precisely. It cut out so much of the logistical headache. And because of this unique microclimate, the sun, the soil, the altitude, we have to talk about the product itself, because this wasn't just about volume. It became about branding.
Oh, this is my favorite part of the notes. I think people assumed that back in the 70s, it was just, generic weed, a bag of grass.
Yeah.
But there was real marketing happening here.
There was. And it wasn't just marketing fluff. It was based on agricultural quality. The region produced strains that became legendary. The gold standard literally was Santa Marta gold.
Which I've heard referenced in pop culture a million times, but I never knew it was specific to this mountain range.
It was the export standard. It had this golden hue because of how they sun-dried it and the specific genetics of the plant in that soil, but it got even more specialized.
Like Mona.
Right, Mona, or blonde. Higher up in the mountains, the Arhuaco growers, who are indigenous to the region, they were selecting these ultra-pale varieties.
And then there was Cielo Azul.
Blue sky blonde. This was a pale hybrid developed in the late 70s, and this shows you the sophistication. The sources say it was reportedly developed using Thai seed stock.
From Thailand.
From Thailand. They were importing genetics from halfway across the world to crossbreed in the Colombian mountains to create a premium product for the American market.
That's incredible. It wasn't just weeds in a ditch. It was horticulture.
It was genetics, it was branding, it was quality control. And this demand for branded Colombian gold is what fueled the rise of the Marimberos.
So let's talk about them. The Marimberos, the name comes from marimba, which was slang for marijuana. But who were they? Were these the early cartels?
This is a really important distinction, and the notes are very clear. No cartels yet. Not in the way we think of them today.
What do you mean?
When we think of a cartel, we think of a corporate hierarchy, right? A CEO, a rigid structure.
Like the Medellin cartel later on.
Exactly. But the Marimberos were different. They were decentralized. They were families and regional networks based on blood and friendship. It was a loose alliance.
So let's walk through the supply chain, because the logistics in the notes are just incredible. It starts with the farmers.
Right. Farmers grew ganja. That's the term used, primarily to survive. For them, it was just a cash crop that paid way better than bananas or coffee.
And you have the muleteers.
The arrieros. These guys were the backbone. They'd haul the pressed cannabis from the High Sierra down these narrow mountain trails to the river mouths. The notes mention Don Diego, Buritaca, and Huachaca.
Those were the collection points.
Where the mountains meet the water, and then the last mile, as you called it, was handled by canoes.
Cayucos.
Yeah, cayucos. Small, unassuming wooden canoes. They'd ferry the product from the river mouths out to motherships waiting offshore. It's low tech, but it's highly effective.
Doesn't show up on radar.
Looks just like a fisherman. But as the boom got bigger, they got more creative.
The notes mentioned banana trucks. buses with hidden compartment.
Oh, absolutely. Banana trucks, speedboats, and eventually, and this is so important for what comes later, they started using light planes.
It sounds like a whole society got involved.
Yeah.
Who was pulling the strings at the top of these networks?
You had two main groups intersecting. First, the Guajiro families, the locals from the La Guajira Peninsula. They were the intermediaries. They had decades of experience in contraband.
Going back to the coffee days we talked about.
Exactly, and even before that. But then you had the Sumerian elite families from the city of Santa Marta. The notes highlight clans like the Davila Armenta and Davila Jimeno.
And what was their role? Why would the elite get involved?
Capital. They brought the money. They controlled the legitimate shipping lines, the export infrastructure, the planes. This wasn't just street-level hustling. This was the upper crust of society getting in on it because the profit was undeniable.
The source material mentions one figure who really embodies this crossover. Jose Rafael Abello Silva.
Mono Abello. He's the prime example of the Marimbero archetype. He was moving weed directly to the U.S. while blending the profits with his legitimate banana and shipping businesses.
Which I assume made the money so much harder to trace.
And it gave him a veneer of respectability. He wasn't just a gangster, he was a businessman.
Yeah.
By the late 1970s, Colombia was supplying the majority of U.S. weed.
The notes say millions were flowing into Colombia. This was the country's first modern drug economy coming fully online.
It was a gold rush. That's why they call it the Bonanza Marimberos. Bonanza means boom. It transformed the region.
But, as with any gold rush, it eventually drew a lot of attention. The party couldn't last forever.
No. In 1978, the hammer starts to come down.
That's the year joint pressure hit both La Guajira and Florida.
Right. The U.S. government finally realized the scale of what was happening. You saw militarization, heavy interdiction in the Caribbean, Coast Guard cutters,
The whole deal.
and eradication efforts starting to constrict that flow. But this is where we get to the core concept of this deep dive. If you take away one thing, it should be this. The DEA called this era the runway.
The runway, meaning this was just the takeoff strip for something much, much bigger.
Exactly. See, during the 1970s, pot was a priority for law enforcement, but it wasn't the same kind of priority that the war on drugs became later, and early cocaine. It was barely on the radar.
So because the heat wasn't fully turned up yet.
The Marimberos were able to build the entire infrastructure in relative peace. They established the air routes to Florida. They figured out which customs officials in Miami could be bribed. They built the crews, the distribution channels, the money laundering systems.
They did all the R&D.
They did all the heavy lifting of building a transnational criminal enterprise, basically in plain sight.
So when the Marimbero network started to fracture in the mid-'80s, that infrastructure didn't just disappear.
No, a business infrastructure that valuable, it just gets repurposed. By the mid-'80s, two things happened. First, domestic cultivation of marijuana in the U.S. skyrocketed.
People started growing their own.
Right, with indoor tech. So demand for Colombian weed dropped. And second,
Cocaine.
cocaine profits began to surge. The economics just shifted completely. Cocaine is smaller, lighter, and vastly more profitable per kilo.
I remember an analogy. A suitcase of marijuana is worth thousands. A suitcase of cocaine is worth hundreds of thousands.
It's a density of value issue. So the infrastructure built by the Marimberos, the runway, it was inherited by the next generation.
Which brings us to the names everyone knows.
The Medellin cartel, led by Pablo Escobar, and the Cali cartel. They didn't have to start from scratch. They didn't have to map the jungle or find the pilots.
They just landed their planes on the runway the marijuana smugglers had already paved for them.
It's terrifyingly efficient. It's the evolution of an industry. The Marimbero era proved you could run a global illicit economy from the Colombian coast. The cartels just scaled it up. They turned a family business into a multinational corporation.
So if we look back at this, it's a straight line. Coffee smugglers dodging a trade agreement, to marijuana farmers filling a market gap, to industrial-scale cocaine cartels inheriting the whole system.
It really challenges that idea that these things just pop up out of nowhere. It wasn't a spontaneous explosion of crime. It was an economic evolution.
Driven by specific pressures and geographic advantages, it's almost like a business case study.
It is. It's supply chain management at its most extreme.
So why does it matter that we know about Santa Marta Gold and the Marimberos? Why not just focus on the big villains?
Because we often look at the drug trade through the lens of personalities. We want a kingpin to blame. But the Marimbera era shows us it's really about systems. It's about economic forces. If you squeeze one area like Mexico, the trade just moves to another.
The balloon effect.
Right. And understanding that history helps us realize that just cutting off the head of the snake doesn't work. if the infrastructure, the runway, is still there.
That is a powerful perspective.
Yeah.
It makes you look at a simple policy decision like that coffee agreement in a totally different light.
It does.
I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to chew on. We talked about how this all started with a coffee trade agreement. The goal was to regulate prices, make things stable.
A standard bureaucratic move.
Right. But think about the Cobra effect. The idea that an attempted solution makes the problem worse. If that coffee agreement had never happened, if those initial smugglers hadn't been forced to find a back door for their beans, would the Marimbero networks have ever formed?
It's a valid question. Without them, maybe the infrastructure wouldn't have been ready for the cocaine boom.
And if they hadn't formed, would the cartels of the 80s have had a runway to take off from? Or would history have looked completely different?
That is the ultimate what if.
A massive unintended consequence that changed the world. Thanks for diving in with us today.
It's always a pleasure.
And to you listening, next time you pour a cup of coffee, maybe think about the hidden history brewing inside it. We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.